For me, empathy is one of the keys to counteracting the dehumanization that underpins hate and violence and discrimination. So that's why I put such an emphasis on empathy. And I think the arts are able to do that better than pretty much anything else because we're all about relationship. We're all about storytelling.
Welcome to the Belonging Chronicles. This is a production of Revolve Consulting, a business dedicated to helping organizations and the people within them build and sustain a culture of belonging for all. In this episode, we thought it would be fun to prepare for the holidays with a conversation about how we can disagree without being disagreeable, and what that means for building belonging in our organizations and our personal lives. After that, we'll be talking with our guest, Scott Galbraith, a theater and arts leader, about building belonging, the arts, and leadership. Let's get started. I'm Jeff Bucholtz, and I use any and all pronouns.
And I'm Janelle Melendrez, and I use she, her pronouns.
So to begin this episode, we thought having a discussion about belonging in relationship to a topic that comes up all the time around the holidays might be useful. How can we maintain belonging when discussing things about which we deeply disagree? To help prime us, we turn to Stanford scholar Dan Edelstein, who in 2022 shared his tips for civil discourse in an article titled 5 Tips for Disagreeing Agreeably Over the Holidays. We'll start by sharing his main points, and then we'll go through them one at a time. Edelstein's top 5 list included: be willing to change your mind, be curious about why other people feel the way they do, avoid labels, share your experiences, and hear what others are truly saying. Now, before we fully dive in, we wanted to say a few words about this conversation. We're approaching this with the specific context and perspective that the person or people with whom we are engaging are not attacking us personally. They're not using stereotypes to microaggress us, and are otherwise not causing us any severe personal emotional distress. In these cases, a different set of strategies may be needed, the first of which is going to be assessing our personal safety. With that understanding, let's start with be willing to change your mind. Edelstein writes, to move from debate to deliberation, it's really your state of mind that has to change. When we're debating, we're fast, we're excited, we're passionate. That's a terrible state of mind to be in if you want to be deliberative. You need to stay open-minded and be more reflective on things. You have to slow down, not let your emotions get fired up by what someone says when you disagree with them. It's saying to yourself, okay, I don't agree with that, but I'm still going to listen. And sometimes you might even find yourself agreeing with an idea or point you'd previously rejected. Janelle, what are your thoughts on this one?
First, I just want to acknowledge that this is not easy to do, and it takes practice. And yes, if we're to look at situations of disagreement as opportunities to learn about the other person, about ourselves, about the issue, then it takes the pressure off of us from needing to prove that we're right or that we need to win. The idea of slowing down, breathing, being sure to exhale longer than we inhale, all of those things actually do help us to calm down, to slow our heart rate in the moment. And I think they do poise us to be able to better engage with people who are sharing ideas that we think that we're in a disagreement with. But it also allows us to be able to listen with curiosity rather than listening to formulate our own response. And so I really do appreciate this suggestion, because if we can do that in the moment, breathe, take it in, and be willing to realize that we're wrong or that the other idea has merit, I think it does go a long way in keeping those relationships.
This recommendation immediately made me think of Danielle Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, which I will credit you, Ms. Janelle, for having introduced me to. It's a great text. And in it, he writes, and I quote him here real quick, our comforting conviction that the world makes sense rests on a secure foundation, our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. I love that quote.
Yeah.
I find it so true in my life, my experience. For those of you who haven't read the book, the title kind of gives it away: Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And when we're operating in the fast, we're less patient and we're more likely to stereotype. And when we're slow, we're more deliberate. And I think for me, that idea of like ignoring our ignorance is always, for me, always easier when we are operating with speed, when we are going
Absolutely.
fast. And I think when it comes to building belonging in particular, especially with people we know well, that mindfulness, that intention of slowing down our reactions, which is, I think, right, part of what the benefit of the breathing is. It slows
Mhm.
us a bit. Okay, next up is be curious about why other people feel the way they do. So Edelstein says, even if what the person across the table is saying to you seems completely orthogonal, in other words, oppositional to everything you believe, it can still be interesting to figure out, why do some people seem to be so persuaded by a completely different worldview than yours? It's important to not write off people as stupid or inferior, he writes, which can happen when we get heated and we're responding more based on an emotional reaction than a reflective one. Janelle, your thoughts?
I just want to reiterate here that that point that you made when we opened up this segment, as long as the person is not causing harm to the environment, then I can get on board with this idea, right?
Yeah.
If they are causing harm and intentionally working to agitate others, I think it's a perfect time for some clear boundaries. And apart from that, I would lean into attempting to understand their perspective. Absolutely. I always love the statement, and I use it all the time: say more, right? When somebody is saying something and I don't quite understand it, or it's different from what I've learned, I'll say more, out of curiosity and invitation, making sure that they feel I'm not like, say more, right? But it's an invitation to bring out more information. And I do that without offering my opinion, but just really wanting to better understand how they've come to the perspective that they have, that they're sharing with me. And when it reminds me, when I was working on my master's degree in marriage and family therapy, I had this professor who would always use this question, and you've heard me say this all the time, Jeff, right? But it's something that I adopted and has just stuck with me. And she would always say, "What recruited you to believe?" and then fill in the blank. And what I love about this question is that it helps the person to become more introspective about their thoughts and ideas in a way that usually they haven't done before. We often are conditioned by systems and societies and practices. And this question for me helps to bring to light those things that help give me as a listener a greater sense of what is influencing the person who's talking. And so the say more and what recruited you to believe the thing is a space for me where I can stay inside my curiosity and just really look to learn from this person, because everyone, no matter how much we agree or disagree, is offering us space to grow, learn, do better, have broader perspectives. And these questions to me really get into that opportunity for me as a listener to learn from them.
Okay, I just want to acknowledge, and by the way, to all our listeners, Janelle really does ask this question: what recruited you? And I think what I've always appreciated about it is that as the person on the receiving end, it is getting at this real interest in understanding what's driving that for me. And so it immediately helps mitigate defensiveness, is how I'll put it. It really helps kind of like mute or tamp down that defensive reactions, and I think communicates a real interest in people.
Yeah, I think that you had it right on. I think it makes it external in a way, right? So there's no judgment from me, and tone is everything, right? The way that we say things, matters for sure.
What the F recruited you into thinking that?
Exactly, right.
It's
Like,
not
so
going
we
to
have to
work. Yeah.
be aware of that. But But I think what it does is when we're asking something, what recruited you to believe, it takes it away from my judgment of it. And it's more about their process, right? What are the things that have been in place that got you there? I really want to understand this rather than why do you think that,
Yeah,
right?
what's wrong
Why,
with you, basically?
yeah, why do you think
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Where'd you get that from, right? Instead of those things, what are the factors that have been in place that got you to here is different than sort of the blaming that can come with or the shaming that can come with other types of questions.
Yeah. For me, with the point that Edelstein is making about kind of like not writing people off,
Mhm.
and not doing that. And I feel like this is a constant practice for anyone, I think, trying to build belonging, avoiding that fundamental attribution error, which as a reminder is a bias that occurs in humans when we attribute others' actions to their like personality or their character without taking their experiences and the context that they're in into account. And I think that avoiding that is something that really helps me not demean or belittle those with different opinions. Because I can think of what they said and be like, they're uneducated or they're mean. And while that sometimes may be true, it's not helpful. I don't think when we see others as only that, when we start to
Mhm.
sum them up in that way, because it breaks down empathy. It breaks down our empathy, which is not helpful to them or to us, honestly. All right, next up is avoid labels. Edelstein writes, if I disagree with you and the first words out of my mouth are, well, that's dumb, or I think that's stupid, then I'm being disagreeable. Understatements. What our colleagues at the Deliberative Democracy Lab have found is that if you abstain from names and labels and instead talk about ideas and policies, then with some exceptions, you can often have an open conversation with somebody who comes at it from a different political point of view. Janelle, what does this one conjure up for you?
Um, 100%, I agree that we want to abstain from using labels with people. I haven't ever found a time where calling someone a name helped in that situation for both parties. Never seen it, never experienced it. I will say also that when we use labels like the ones that are expressed in this article and the quote that you just read, they can also be very harmful to folks with different social identities in ways that we may not intend, right? So labels can be often very problematic. Instead, we can name how we're feeling about it. We can name, instead of saying that something isn't a worthy argument, we can say, when you say that, it makes me think of these things, or I experience this sensation in my body when I hear you say those kinds of things. And so typically, when we are hearing something that we disagree with, we want to be careful not to replicate the same harm that we're trying to stop when we're talking about family and those boundaries aren't as clear and our patience isn't as high. We sometimes can replicate the very harm that we're faulting them for bringing into a space. And so that's, I think, where I find labels problematic.
Yeah, I find that really insightful, and it resonates a lot with me. This practice, right? This idea of avoiding labels comes up for me as having two benefits at minimum, at
Mhm.
least two benefits. The first is that by not name calling, we immediately, just in a practical sense, help prevent defensiveness. So it immediately helps with that. And that alone is going to prevent us, I think, from going back to that quick brain, quick response mode where we're more likely to be impatient and mean and stereotype, et cetera. The second benefit is that by not name calling, we are helping ourselves not bring in bias. Because I don't know about you or our listeners, but when I start to assign names or characteristics to people, I am definitely more likely to bring in bias with me. In fact,
Yeah.
I am actually quite convinced, because I've been reflecting on this a lot. I am quite convinced that I am basically using the name so that I can bring in all the biases associated with it. Like I'm using the
Mhm.
name so I can bring those biases in. In fact, that's kind of almost the purpose of naming it that way, right? So you are X, right? You're mean. And so with that comes all of these judgments that fuel the fundamental attribution errors we were talking about earlier, but it just fuels the fire. So it's like a stepping stone to be able to bring in biases that are going to make it even harder for us to empathize and connect, and are probably going to lead us to be sometimes even unkind or cruel, even
Yeah.
at times, I think, to the people that we're engaging with, right? Because a bias and approaching someone with that bias unchecked can be very harmful, very
Yeah.
harmful.
That's so good, Jeff. That's so good.
Thank you. Next up is share your experiences. Edelstein says, when we bring things back to what we know from experience, what we've been through, what we've seen, then it makes these conversations more interesting and perhaps a bit more harmonious. If someone says something outlandish, you might respond, that's just really not my experience. In fact, my experience has been the opposite. Or, oh, where did that happen? That sounds really surprising to me. None of my friends seem to have that experience. So this is what he wrote around this idea of sharing your experiences. What does this have you thinking about, Janelle?
That I literally do this all the time. And I think what it does is it frees me from having to know all the things and all the facts about everything, and it allows me to stick with the only thing that I am absolutely an expert on, that I have never, ever gotten wrong. And that's my
Yes.
experiences. And so one thing that happens when I'll use me, am in a situation where somebody is sharing something and it's an agitated kind of conversation, that sometimes it builds up in me that, oh, I got to know all the right answers. I got to do all of, what's the name of that book again? Right. Like all of those things where I gotta know my stuff here. Right. And we often hear this from people in organizations. I didn't say anything because I didn't know all of the right things to say at the moment. Right. I think
Yeah.
it releases that responsibility from us when we can say, I'm going to stick to my experiences. And my experiences might be, I'm not really sure how to say this right now, but I do know that I'm feeling very uncomfortable with the things that you're saying. And so right now, I'm going to remove myself from the situation because I'm feeling uncomfortable. I don't know why, but we can talk about it later, right? Because that's my experience. I don't know what's wrong with what you're saying. I don't know where it's wrong for me, but I do know that I feel really uncomfortable and icky, and I'm going to name that thing. And so
Yeah.
I think that it just releases me from the responsibility of being the expert in the room who knows all of the things about everything you're talking about, even though this is just the third time I've ever heard of it, right? And so I think that's what it does for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I have found
Yeah.
that to be very helpful in my life as well. And I'll say for me, we talked about this many times, that central to building belonging is really learning from the different experiences that people have.
Uh-huh.
And for me, I think it's critically important for us to do that through a lens in which we seek out the experiences of others, in particular those that are different from us.
Uh-huh.
It also, though, requires that we be willing to share our experiences and how they differ from others without critiquing or juxtaposing them with the other's experience. In other words, to be able to share my experience and not have it be in a constant comparison to yours, that like we can have two different experiences,
Uh-huh.
and that we can both be enriched by understanding that difference. And that
Yeah.
that is critical to building belonging, because we don't all have the same experiences, like obviously.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And to your point, we're not on a scale of whose experience is better, whose
Yeah.
experience is more valid, who is it, like we're not in competition in that way either, right?
Okay. Finally, here's the last one. Hear what others are truly saying. So Edelstein writes, deliberation requires actively listening to what people are saying. and not trying to counter them to prove that you're right and they're wrong. We make a point of defining active listening as a very specific kind of listening. It's active in the sense that you have to constantly check yourself so that you stay in this more deliberative mode rather than having an instinctive or repulsive reaction to what someone says. So Janelle, once again, your thoughts.
You know, in the middle of the holidays, all this election stuff, I think it is so important. We haven't always had the best examples of active listening, of receiving what people say to be their truth without demonizing it, making it about something that's wrong with them. And we bring together in the holidays all kinds of opinions and perspectives and experiences. And that's part of the point in the holidays, right? To be able to share love and joy and connect with one another. And I've never seen a clause that says, if you think and act like me, right?
Right. Yeah. That we can get together, but only if we agree on everything.
Exactly. And so I think that the deliberate active listening means that we have to check ourselves, right? Because some of us are in the habit of being the one who takes up a lot of space in a room. We are in the habit of being the one that everyone just assumes you are right. We are in the habit of not having anyone disagree with us. And some of us are in the habit of the opposite, right? We are used to no one really listening to us. We're used to keeping all of our thoughts and opinions to ourselves. And in the holidays, can you imagine what that would be like if people got to be their full and authentic selves respectfully and got to be heard? All I know is for me, when someone is actively listening to me, so they're not constantly interrupting me and asking me the questions that they want to hear the answers to. They're allowing me the space to share my thoughts, my ideas, my perspectives, my experiences. Then that's where I build connection with those people. But if we can actively listen, meaning we are not only hearing, but we're receiving. So in a program that we both used to teach in, the professor would say, "Ago," a Moja program, "Ago." The response was "Ame." "Ago." Are you ready to listen? "Ame." Not yes. Not I hear you. It's I am ready to receive. I am ready to receive. Active listening to me is also an investment in the relationship that's happening between two people that says, I'm not going to derail you from what you're trying to say. I want to receive what you're saying so that I can grow in my perspective. And I want to be here. So you get to be who you are and explain your thoughts because they're valuable. Even if I don't fully value them yet, I know they're valuable to you. So I'm going to leave that with some space to breathe so that it can help me in growing who I am as well.
I think that it's a great way to wrap up this section.
So we shared the 5 strategies that were highlighted in this article. The holidays are here. We'd love to hear from you. So why don't you go ahead and add a comment? What are some strategies that you use to make sure that you can disagree without being disagreeable during the holidays?
Drop it in the comments. All right, so we are most excited to welcome to the podcast Scott Galbraith. Scott is an accomplished arts and entertainment professional and consultant who strives to foster environments of belonging where creators and administrators produce exceptional work, incite joy, and nurture empathy. Scott has a long and distinguished record as a leader and executive in the arts, including at the Walton Arts Center, Orlando Fringe, and the Bushnell Center for Performing Arts. Throughout that work, he has demonstrated a dedication to collaborative practices, innovation, anti-racism, diplomacy, and excellence within multidisciplinary international arts environments. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much. It sounds like I have had a career.
Yeah,
Indeed, you have. Indeed, you
indeed you
have.
have. Your focus on inciting joy and nurturing empathy through the arts, I find really interesting. And Janelle and I were wondering, why do you think these emotions, joy and nurturance and empathy, are so important for audiences and artists alike?
Oh, well, empathy first. I mean, empathy is everything. I mean, it's particularly now in the hyper polarized world in which we live. Empathy is about connecting not just intellectually but emotionally with other people, and it requires that we first recognize each other as human beings, but it also requires that we actively seek to understand somebody else's perspective and imagine how they might feel in a particular situation or about a particular event, policy, practice. For me, when empathy exists, hate is really hard to summon or to maintain. Well, I put it another way, to put it in the positive sense, for me, empathy is one of the keys to counteracting the dehumanization that underpins hate and violence and discrimination. So that's why I put such an emphasis on empathy. And I think the arts are able to do that better than pretty much anything else because we're all about relationship, we're all about storytelling. And with regard to joy, well, for me, it has two aspects. One is yes, the happiness, the elation, the freedom aspect of it, because there's a community being created, with an absence of division. So there's great value just in joy as it stands. But a couple of years ago, I presented a dance company, an LA-based dance company called Contratiempo. They're an activist dance company. And the performance was called Joyas Justas. And it's spelled joy, capital U, capital S, as in United States, just US. And as part of that performance, or part of the essence of that work, is that joy is the ultimate expression of resistance. I had not viewed joy that way before. So when I talk about inciting joy, it's about, yes, creating a community where there's peace and harmony, but it's also about giving voice to and a celebration of the resistance movements that exist and have existed and do exist with regard to systematic racism that exists in the country.
Yeah, that's so good. It immediately has me thinking about how some communities, particularly marginalized communities, have been limited from being able to have their full experience of being human acknowledged, and part of that is the absence of acknowledging joy inside of their human experience. I so appreciate what you're sharing here with us, Scott. I wanted to bring up a quote from James Baldwin that we love, and it reads, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers." And you talked about seeking to understand, and so much of that has to do with questions. And so we're wondering from you, what would you say are the questions that need to be regularly asked in order to advance belonging in the arts?
Well, I think one of the leading questions that people need to become comfortable asking is, what role might I be playing in this? Inadvertently, overtly, but what role might I have? It's not to say that one is directly responsible, but it requires that we look for it and not simply wait for the most obvious examples to be presented to us on the evening news. And so for me, I think the primary question is, what role might I have in perpetuating harm? And then taking responsibility for it.
So before you became an executive producer and a vice president of programming, you were a performer. You mentioned this earlier. So you've been an actor and you've worked with actors, and acting from my perspective is certainly about seeing how far you can come to truly empathize with and understand someone else, namely your character, right? Like how close can I get to understanding this other person? So I'm curious, how has that process of coming to truly empathize and understand someone else come to inform your work to build belonging?
I love this question, but I'm going to give you an answer, but it's not related specifically to my work as a paid actor anyway. As I think, we're an adoptive family. Our kids are biological siblings, but my wife and I are not don't share any biology with them. And so we jumped into their lives when they were like 10 and 11. And so we got kids who were with, very much formed personalities. And we quickly came to find that despite all the training that we'd had, we were still ill-equipped to help them in certain ways. And we, through a counselor, learned about the teachings of Heather Forbes, and that led us to Casey Family Services, where the counselor was actually working. And through that, we learned parenting techniques that were benefited by the fact that we were actors. Because it was about being the parent your child needed at the time, as opposed to living in your own reality as a parent, with your own history, with your own strengths and challenges. We needed to compartmentalize our personalities and set aside our own emotional needs or triggers at that moment, and be who our children needed us to be in the moment. And I will tell you that learning that, and that we ultimately became trainers of future foster and adoptive parents in the techniques, because we found it to be so effective and so immediately effective. To say it happened like the very next day is not an exaggeration. We started to see change immediately, again, because we changed. So we became trainers, but the skills absolutely come with me into the workplace, because the conversation no longer becomes about what I need or what the company needs, but it's about creating a safe emotional space for the person that I'm working with to be able to express themselves, to feel like they're really being heard, to feel like somebody understands that there's challenge. But because it's all based in making safety, physical and emotional safety. So as I say, it's not a direct correlation of the acting skills in my career, but I think it's an important correlation.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. What do you think others outside of theater, outside of the arts, might learn from theater and acting about building belonging?
Well, I would say, among other things, the ability, the need for, the importance of putting other people ahead of yourself, company mission, company policies, all very important. But companies are made up of people. Therefore, people are more important than any of those policies and that mission. Because if we don't have a healthy working environment with people who feel like they belong and are valued and feel humanized, then we're not really going to be successful in achieving our mission, in enforcing policy, and having practices observed. So we need to remember that people are the company.
Thank you, Scott. We're going to lean on that question and then take it broad and specific at the same time. And so the question is, what value might there be for the non-theater world to have the arts lead the way in anti-racism and building cultures of belonging?
Well, it's interesting because I think to some degree, the arts already does that. And I think it can be, I think that could be accentuated more, and I think that story can be told more loudly and more frequently. I attended a conference a number of years ago in New York. It was a kind of conference where because it's New York, it's the Broadway community, celebrity drop-ins were not uncommon at all. And in one particular year, Jon Stewart came and delivered an address to the group. It was a planned address. And one of the things that he said really stuck with me, and it was not that there's no value in TV, film, and other media, but that those art forms tend to reflect culture more than they lead culture, whereas the arts, and specifically theater in his delivery, lead culture. But the arts really have the ability to help lead culture in communities around the country, not necessarily just because of the big blockbusters and the Broadway series of the world, but in the regional theaters. There's tremendous value in that part of the arts ecosystem as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've got a little preface for this question, so I'm gonna give me a moment. This is gonna be like a cable news interview question here, where I go on for a little bit to set it up. Okay, so as you know, but our audience may not, in 2020, the theater world was challenged and inspired by a letter from hundreds of people of color inside the theater industry called "We See You, White American Theater." And the letter calls out the systemic racism, the exploitation and exclusion that the BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community has and had long endured within the industry. And the writers in this letter declare that they will no longer tolerate the abuse, the inequity, the gaslighting and apathy to their experiences, saying that they are intent on exposing the institutions and individuals perpetuating those injustices with a commitment to protect and uplift the most marginalized among them. And this letter served as an enormous catalyst, as you know, for leadership in theaters, in particular leaders who are white, to focus on and advance anti-racism and racial diversity in everything that they do. And so with that, we were curious, as a white leader, what do you see as the long-term effect of that letter on the industry? And in particular, what do you think other white leaders should learn from the letter and the actions the industry has and hasn't taken in response to the letter?
That was a long lead in, you're right, but a fascinating question. Well, first of all, I have a signer. I have signed on to that letter, but I am obviously not an author. Not obviously, I am not an author of that letter. While I embrace it completely, I think the proof will, of course, be in the pudding. But I think that, jumping back for a second, I think the timeline around the letter is important because it informs a little bit what my thoughts and feelings are on the bulk of your question. So timeline-wise, the We See You letter was released in, I think, June of 2020, which is about 3 months after COVID-19 reached the shores of the US, with the shutdown of theaters and other large gathering spaces happening in sort of March, April. So the letter was released about 3 months after all that mishigas started. So that the fact that many of us were shut down at the time, or working remotely at least, if not laid off, because many people were, it allowed arts organizations to devote time to creating statements of allyship and some even creating action plans. But in the return to normal, air quotes, normal business, and the slow return of audiences that we're still working through now, generally, in my estimation, focus has diverted from those statements and those action plans. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think what's needed for the long-term effect to be a positive one is that tools are now needed to help white leaders understand how to activate those statements and plans, how to lead the anti-racism efforts that they have signed on to, and how to lead as a white person, not in isolation, because the work cannot be done without people of color in arm in arm with white people. But it shouldn't be left to people of color to do the hard work, clearly, which is part of what I think the letter is getting to. So I think there's a lot that has not yet been done. I don't say that necessarily as an overt criticism. I think it's just an observation of fact. I think there's great intention, but I think now people in my position need help to now understand that's great, but how do I actually do this? How do I make this happen? And I think there's an opportunity to create community of leaders in the arts, and then to empower them with tangible, actionable skills.
You know, in thinking about the skills, right? How have you personally adapted your leadership and creative strategies to navigate the shifts that were demanded and requested and noted in the letter?
So for me, that shift started, I think, probably it was in the early 2000s, probably around 2010, 2009. When I was at the Bucholtz Center for the Performing Arts, I helped co-adapt and then produce what eventually became a small national tour of a show called Warriors Don't Cry, which is based on the award-winning memoir of Melba Pattillo Beals called Warriors Don't Cry. And it is her memoir as one of the Little Rock Nine, and it's her documentation of her experience during that time period. And as we were, so I was I am not a Black person. My co-adapter was not a Black person. The director of the show was not a Black person. To make sure that we were overcoming those deficits, and I take full responsibility that I helped put together that team. And in retrospect, I probably could have done a better job. Not that everybody who was on the team wasn't exceptionally skilled, they were, but I could have done a better job in making sure that we were a more diverse producing team. But to help address those deficits, we reached out to the Black community in Hartford, and we pulled in business leaders, church leaders, other thought leaders, business leaders, to understand more fully what we had written. And so at the first table read, we had a group of people at the table to help us hear the piece through their ears and to understand the experience that we were creating through their lived experience and through their understanding of history, which would be more nuanced than mine. So that spirit stays with me. And I have since started looking at how arts companies, particularly performing arts centers, because that's been the bulk of my career lately, how we go about curating experiences for predominantly white audiences, not exclusively, but predominantly, but doing it outside of sort of a white Western lens. And so I'm now more focused on finding ways to curate in collaboration with the communities that the work represents and to present it through that lens. What I'm trying to do now is take a much more complete approach to the presentation of the arts, to the production of arts.
That's great. We've heard so much about your very rich experience, and you've spent years as a leader working on building belonging. What are the most important lessons that you've learned as a leader from that experience?
I will make
That
mistakes.
experience of building belonging. Yeah. You will make mistakes.
I will make mistakes. I will. I just admitted one a minute ago with regard to the creation of Warriors Don't Cry. But that's okay. We will all cause harm, some harm, as we educate ourselves about racism, or ableism or ageism or homophobia, as we work to implement anti-racism policies and procedures, we're going to create some harm along the way. But that's not an excuse for not doing the work. I mean, because guess what? Harm is already being done. Doing nothing simply perpetuates the harm and frankly makes us complicit in that harm. So for me, it becomes a matter of choice. The real choice, the honest choice is whether to cause harm in the pursuit of equity or to extend, centuries long history of harm and just perpetuate that which is already happening and stick my head in the sand. And by the way, I think in choosing the path of equity, you become better at it and eventually cause less harm because you have learned from your mistake and you are conscious, you are careful not to repeat it.
We've spoken a fair amount here about leadership and anti-racism, and you've identified yourself as a white person who is leading and has led anti-racism initiatives. What is something you think would be helpful for other white leaders in particular to know about leading and participating in anti-racism initiatives?
Well, I think to some degree it has to do with goal setting because many of us are very goal-oriented. Our organizations require it, and sort of the definition of leadership is very goal-oriented, and we need to be able to check boxes for funders and board members and others. Not to place blame on those folks, that's not my intention. But I think creating belonging through anti-racism work, it's not a destination. It really is a journey. And if we view it as a special project, then we're setting ourselves up to try and make it a destination. But when we view it as an essential part of our everyday operations, we understand that it's a journey and that it's ongoing, and then it becomes normalized. That work becomes normalized. The perspective becomes normalized and gets integrated into the organization at the DNA level. And I think that's an essential step. I would also remind white people in arts leadership roles that in your organization, you set the tone and you set the pace of anti-racism work in your organization. And it's best not to delegate leadership on that. If it's truly important, if it's truly a goal for it to be part of your day-to-day operations, to be thoroughly integrated, it's okay to find other aspects of your to-do list to delegate. But this one you really ought not delegate, because people will see the difference. And if there isn't a visual commitment from leadership, guess what? That's emperor's new clothes. I think maybe the last thing would be to say that it's okay if you don't know where to start. As I mentioned earlier, there are ample resources to help with that, Revolve being one, but it's not okay not to start. That is not okay.
Beautiful. Scott, thank you so much. Before we let you go, we would like to play a quick game with you to help our listeners get to know you better. And we call this Rapid Reactions. So we're going to ask you some random questions, and you're going to share, we hope, with us the first thing that pops into your mind. Don't have to stress the answers, or they don't have to be perfect. It's just first thing that pops in your mind in response to the question.
Too late. I already grabbed a fidget toy.
Perfect.
You're all ready.
Already. Okay, here we go. So first question, favorite movie of all time?
Oh my gosh. Wally.
Perfect. Next up, a childhood hero, someone you looked up to.
Again, had a couple, a swim coach, but more specifically, my mentor in high school, who was the head of the theater program.
A song you want to dance to anytime you hear it.
And you're going to think I'm a dork, but I'm going to say it. Just about anything Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass.
Perfect. Favorite book you've read recently?
Cast. It's a little over a year ago, but I had to put that book down a couple times for weeks on end while I processed what I was reading.
What is your favorite all-time guilty pleasure TV show?
Guilty pleasure? There was a period of time where we were addicted to Big Bang Theory.
Someone who regularly inspires you.
I'm talking to them.
Oh,
right now.
What superpower would you like to have for a day?
This is my son's. I stole it from him. I'd like the ability to manipulate probability.
Oh, so good.
Ooh, that was
really stealing that too.
Because you can change the probability of success.
Okay,
I know, he's a deep
it's supposed to be
thinker.
rapid. I was still.
It's supposed to be rapid, and we're like, wow, that's really deep for a superhero power.
Oh my goodness. Okay, your go-to comfort movie.
One that you pretty much have to watch when it's on. If you run across it as American President, we just get sucked into it every single time.
A snack or treat that you just can't stop eating.
I have a hard time stopping with goldfish.
A current famous person you'd like to make prank calls with.
Okay, but say who came to my mind when I thought the question was going in a certain direction. Dr. Gates, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. I thought it was going to be like who would we want to have lunch with or have a cocktail party with. But I would make prank calls with him too.
All right. And favorite childhood cartoon?
Speed Racer.
Best movie soundtrack of all time?
Gotta be a John Williams. Just pick one.
Fair enough. Which fictional world would you like to live in?
I have no idea. Never even thought about it.
What do you love to geek out about most?
These days, I geek out about politics. I'm sorry.
You don't have to be sorry. It's your geek out.
I am, because it's very stressful.
And last one here. What is your favorite dream vacation spot?
The beach somewhere. That's pretty golden.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Scott Galbraith, for taking the time and putting in the effort and energy to talk to us and share with our listeners your experience and perspectives. We are immensely grateful.
Well, thank you. I'm honored that you asked. Great spending time with you both. Always.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, this concludes this episode of the Belonging Chronicles. Please do subscribe and write a comment. Let us know what you're thinking about what you hear. We'd really appreciate it. And of course, if you'd like to reach out to us, you can find us at revolveconsulting.com. We will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.